Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we are in round 4 of our coverage of the 2016 Sinquefield Cup. Yesterday in round 3 we looked at Anish Giri versus Ding Lian in a very exciting match. Today we have the last two champions. White's going to be played by Levon Aronian, currently the 5th ranked player in the world, and he won last year. So he understands this tournament, what it takes to win. So far, he has 2 draws and a win, so he's looking to have a nice game with the white pieces. His opponent playing the black pieces, currently the 4th ranked player in the world, the top American, Fabiano Caruana, who just missed out on getting to the World Championship at the end of this year. But he is not. Maybe another year he'll get that opportunity. But 2 years ago, he won this tournament, and he had one of the greatest performances of all time, if you don't remember. We had a similar field as we have in this tournament, except we add in Magnus Carlsen. So as you can imagine, very tough field, and he won the first 7 games at the tournament. Just unheard of. All the competitors there said he was playing at a different level. Just no one could stop him. He definitely went on to win that tournament fairly easy. So we'll go ahead and get started with Levon Aronian playing pawn to d4, knight f6, pawn c4, pawn e6, and knight f3. Pawn down here to c5, pawn e3, just seeing what his opponent is planning on doing. Pawn a6, knight c3, and then pawn to d5. So this is the Queen's Gambit decline line. Took a few variations to get here, but this is the Tadash variation in the Queen's Gambit decline line. White continues with pawn takes on d5, and then after the pawn recaptures, pawn to g3. Now, this isn't usually what you see in the Tadash variation. Usually, it's going to be the pawn takes on c5. This gives black an isolated pawn. Now, it does open up the board for these bishops to just reign free, really control a lot of the board, can even take right away with bishop takes on c5 and control that way. But with this isolated pawn, black's going to be forced to really put a lot of his pieces defending this, and as we get into the end game, usually black has a tougher time if a lot of the pieces have come off the board. But instead, we see a slightly different variation. We see pawn to g3, and the knight to c6, just getting more pieces involved into the action. Bishop here to g2. Definitely what we expected to see after pawn to g3. Fianchettoing this bishop here to g2, getting ready to castle on the king side. Bishop to d6. So many times we see the pawn already here on d6, so the bishop's going to come to e7, but much more involved into the action with this variation, getting it here to d6 in the center. Now the pawn takes on c5, and then the bishop takes back on c5. So it does kind of buy a move for white, since he forced his opponent to move his bishop twice, and he does still have this isolated pawn here on the d file. So Levon Aronian definitely has a nice little strong start for white. He castles on the king side and then castles on the king side. What's interesting though is his variation after. He plays knight to d4. I thought he could have played just pawn to a3, then push forward with pawn to b4, starting to put pressure on his opponent, kick the bishop back here, and just see what happens. Then you can get your dark square bishop to b2. You could get your knight involved into the action a little bit more, get your rook over here, control this open c file. I thought that would be really, really good, making sure that your opponent still has this isolated pawn. He chose a different route. He played knight to d4, and then after the exchange, the pawn recapture here on d4, and now both sides have an isolated pawn. So not what I was expecting to see on board, but definitely looks like both sides are prepared for this. They played one of the fastest matches ever up until this point. From here, the bishop's going to come back here to a7, bishop to g5, so both sides just continuing their development. Bishop to e6, so both sides just have their queen to get involved, and then they will complete development. Rook to c1, controlling this open file, and then a rook over here to c8, doing the same thing. White continues, bishop takes on f6, and then the queen comes down here to f6. Knight up here, d5. At this point, we do have the queen and the bishop both eyeing down on this pawn on d4. So white doesn't have a lot of good moves, to be honest, except to take this pawn right away on d5. And that's what he does. After he takes, the bishop recaptures, and then this pawn is going to fall at some point. Black decides to go ahead and first take here on c1. So after the queen takes, now pawn to b5. He can still kind of wait. There's no way to really stop the bishop coming down here to d4. So first starts out with pawn to b5, pushing a little bit forward. Queen up here to c6. Says now's a good time to go ahead and take that pawn. And then the exchange on board, bishop takes back on f6. So at this point, as they get the queens off the board, it almost seems like they're playing for a draw. They just don't have a ton of material left. Unless someone makes a huge error, this is definitely going to be a draw. Continues with pawn to b3. If your opponent has a dark square bishop, your plan, in all intents and purposes, is to get your pawns on the light squares, and vice versa. If your opponent has a light square bishop, you need to have your pawns on the dark square. So we see the rook over here to d8, attacking the bishop. Rook here to d1, protecting that. King f8. Now that the queens are off the board, you can start to get your king involved into the action. Get into the center, really make that a strong piece in your attack. Pawn to a5. Bishop back here to f3. It does expose the rook, but it also is protecting it at the same time. After the rook come off, this looks even more like a drawn game. King here to e7. Pawn up here to a4. And after the pawn takes, we see the pawn recapture. These are just going to be stuck here. Neither of the bishops can attack their opponent's pawn. So bishop up here to b3. Bishop here to b4. Outpost, but they're not doing a ton on board. King here to e2, king f8, and then bishop to c4. And in this position, it was a drawn game, and they decided to go ahead and end it for the day. Very, very fast match, to be honest. For those that were watching it and covering it, they were not trying to get into any tough positions. They weren't thinking about it. There was no really crazy variations that they could have even gone into. They played a pretty safe opening on both sides of the board. So all in all, it's exciting to watch the two last champions battle out such a high-level play. But then we do have a drawn game, and it is a quick one. So that is game 4. Hopefully you guys enjoyed and have enjoyed watching all the other rounds. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in round 5.